The Texas wind was dry that November, bone dry, like breath held too long. In the distance, windmills creaked over dust-colored plains, and cotton clouds drifted slow across a pale blue sky. The war, they were told, was still raging. Yet inside the barbed wire of Camp Swift, just east of Bastrop, a silence far stranger than violence was about to fall. They were women of the Reich, daughters of discipline and doctrine, born into Hitler's dream and swept up by his ruin. Nurses, auxiliaries, clerks, and secretaries. Some volunteered, some were conscripted. All wore the gray fabric of defeat. Captured in France, in Italy, some even taken from interned German ships. They had crossed the Atlantic in guarded Liberty ships, their boots silent on American soil. Their enemy had given them soap, clean clothes, a bed with sheets. Already, that was a confusion no handbook had prepared them for. But what came next felt like betrayal. It began with a rumor. One woman said she heard the guards laughing about turkeys. Another swore she saw boxes labeled Ocean Spray in the mess hall. Then, early on the morning of November 22nd, 1944, just 2 days before the American holiday, the truth arrived in a folded piece of paper slipped under the wooden barracks door. It was written in plain, formal German. You are cordially invited to a Thanksgiving meal, to be held in the main hall on the afternoon of November 23rd. Attendance is voluntary. Conduct will remain in accordance with Geneva Convention guidelines. Guests will be American personnel and officers. Dress respectfully. There will be no speeches. There will be food. No one moved. Ilsa, who had once worked behind a typewriter for the Wehrmacht, stared at the page like it might catch fire in her hand. This is a test, she whispered. They want to see who is disloyal, who is weak. Others murmured the same. The Americans had done kind things before. Yes, hot showers, medical care, Red Cross letters. But this crossed a line. A holiday? A celebration? With them? Was it a trap? They met that night in hushed clusters on the barracks floor, hair braided, hands curled around tin mugs of weak coffee. Some argued it was a chance to gather intelligence. Others feared propaganda. One girl from Bremen wept openly. I miss my mother's roast goose, she confessed. Even if it's a trick, I want to taste something that reminds me I'm alive. By morning, most had made their decision. They would go. Because curiosity was stronger than fear. Because hunger had become something more than physical. Because somewhere, buried beneath uniform and rank and years of slogans, they were still human. And so, on Thanksgiving Day, 1944, the gates of Camp Swift opened, not in surrender, but in quiet disbelief. The women walked in lines toward the main hall, under watchtowers that didn't turn their spotlights on. Their camp uniforms were clean. Some had tucked flowers behind their ears, wild sunflowers picked from the fence line. Others held small napkins embroidered with their initials. These were not prisoners marching. These were ghosts approaching a memory they were not sure they had earned. At the entrance, an American corporal held the door open. He smiled, and that, more than anything else, broke the silence. Inside, the hall was warm, real warm, not just from the coal stove in the corner, but from something else, an ease, an invitation that had no words. Folded chairs had been arranged around long wooden tables, real plates, real cutlery, tin pitchers of water, napkins, tablecloths. And at each place, a hand-written name card, each name spelled correctly, with umlauts was where they belonged. The women didn't sit at first. They stared. Then someone gasped. At the far end of the hall, beneath the American flag, stood a buffet table so heavy with food it seemed unreal. Roast turkey, bowls of mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, cornbread stuffing, green beans, sweet potato casserole with marshmallows, apple pie, pumpkin pie, whipped cream. Not one American held a weapon. Not one order was barked. No one filmed. No one paraded. Just quiet voices. Just steam rising from food that smelled like autumn. The same corporal who opened the door cleared his throat and said, in careful German, "Und ladies, you are our guests today. Please, eat. This is Thanksgiving. It is how we say thanks." No one moved, not until the youngest girl, Marta, who had just turned 19, stepped forward with trembling hands. She reached for a slice of bread. No gunshot rang out. No guards yelled. So the others followed. They ate. And as they did, something shifted. A muscle loosened in the jaw. A glance softened. Someone laughed, just once, then covered her mouth in horror, as if it were a crime. But the Americans smiled. One guard passed out small wrapped candies. Another offered to refill water. Someone played soft music from a radio in the corner. Bing Crosby, they would later learn. This wasn't war. This wasn't surrender. This was something no one had taught them how to survive. Kindness. It hung in the room like the scent of roasted turkey. Impossible to ignore, impossible to understand. Not just the food. It was the way the Americans moved. No shouting, no sharp glances. The guards were there, yes, but only in uniform, not in manner. They leaned against the walls, chatted softly, occasionally asked if anyone needed more gravy. Ilsa sat at the end of one long table, her hands folded in her lap. She hadn't touched her food yet. She was still watching. Across from her sat a tall Texan with sunburnt cheeks and sandy hair, maybe 25, maybe 30. He wasn't a soldier like the others. He wore denim overalls and boots dusty from the yard. He looked like he'd stepped off a farm. In fact, many of them had. "Name's Doyle," he said in slow English, then motioned to himself. "Cowboy." He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what she'd done during the war. He didn't look at her like she was an enemy, just like a stranger sitting at the same table, deserving of warm food and space. Then he said the words that would be repeated, over and over again, by every woman at that table for the rest of their lives. They earned it. Ilsa blinked. "What?" Doyle pointed toward the women, now eating in careful silence. "You all earned this. Haul and feed, stacking crates. You work harder than half the boys we had here. My mama always said, you feed folks who earn their bread. Today's thanks." Then, almost shyly, he added, "You remind me of my sister." That moment broke something. Ilsa didn't cry. She hadn't in years. But her fork finally moved. And the mashed potatoes, when they touched her tongue, tasted like nothing she had ever known. Not because they were seasoned or warm, but because they had been given without demand. No one asked her to trade loyalty. No one asked her to confess. They just passed the butter and said, "Welcome." A few chairs down, Lotta, who had once served coffee to SS officers in Vienna, was holding a dinner roll in both hands as if it were made of porcelain. She sniffed it twice, then took the smallest bite imaginable. She closed her eyes. Her lips trembled. "It smells like before," she whispered. Before. Before uniforms. Before flags. Before the Reich taught them that Americans were monsters, capitalists, criminals, devils who would strip them, beat them, brand them. Lotta had believed it. She had seen the propaganda posters, caricatured GIs with fangs and burning eyes. But now she looked around, and all she saw were young men, many not much older than herself, eating off the same plates, chewing slow, nodding to one another like Sunday neighbors. At the table beside hers, Marta couldn't stop staring at the pie. Pumpkin pie. She had never seen anything like it. It was orange, soft, fragrant with spices she didn't recognize, nutmeg, cinnamon, clove. When she finally tasted it, She gasped aloud. The American sitting near her, a lanky soldier from Ohio, laughed softly. "First time?" She nodded. "It tastes like warm," he smiled. "That's what home tastes like." She didn't answer, because her heart was doing something she didn't expect. It was hurting. Not because of war, not because of defeat, but because she realized, in that moment, that this young man, this enemy, was also somebody's son, and that somewhere, his mother might be worrying about whether he was safe, whether he'd had a good meal that day. The walls inside her started to fall. Around the room, the clinking of cutlery, the soft hum of voices, and the occasional bursts of nervous laughter echoed like ghosts of a different world. One where people didn't hate by default. One where sharing a meal was not surrender, but survival. And then came the coffee. It was served in real ceramic mugs, not tin. Hot, dark, strong. Some of the women wept then. Not for caffeine, but for the feeling of normal. That after months of powdered rations and lukewarm water, someone had handed them something fragrant, warm, and breakable. Ilse noticed something on the windowsill. Small glass jars with candles inside, flickering gently. Not electric light. Firelight. It reminded her of Christmas, of her grandmother's house in the Black Forest, of her childhood, before uniforms, before bombs. She closed her eyes and smelled turkey and cinnamon and candle wax. And in that moment, she was not a prisoner. She was just a girl at a table, listening to Bing Crosby croon, "I'll be home for Christmas," in the background. A few of the women asked if they could take the little place cards with them. The guards nodded. One said, "They're yours." Later, someone even offered them seconds. And no one said no, because the hunger that day wasn't just for food. It was for proof that the world hadn't been swallowed whole by hate. That something soft remained. That kindness, real, untraded, unarmed kindness, was still possible, even here, behind barbed wire. When the meal ended, no one rushed to leave. They lingered. Some women helped gather plates. Others folded the napkins. A few whispered Dunka as they passed the Americans, not daring to look too long, because something inside them had shifted, and they didn't know yet what to call it. They didn't know yet what to call it. But the feeling stayed long after the plates were cleared and the candles snuffed out. When they returned to the barracks that night, the camp seemed quieter than ever. The wind outside had gone still, and the stars above the Texas plain looked unnervingly bright, so sharp and clean that even the barbed wire seemed fragile under them. The women sat on their bunks, motionless, their stomachs full and their thoughts loud. Some still wore their napkins around their necks, as if to prove it had happened. Others tucked the paper name cards into pockets or pressed them flat under pillows like secret relics. For Marta, the youngest, it wasn't the food she couldn't forget. It was the way one of the American soldiers, she never learned his name, had placed the slice of pumpkin pie on her plate first, not as a gesture of pity, but as though she were his equal. Equal, it was a dangerous word. Back in Germany, that word could have meant betrayal. But here, in this strange country with its cotton fields and wide skies, the word began to feel like oxygen. Ilse sat by the small window of the barracks, staring out toward the faint lights of Bastrop flickering beyond the trees. Somewhere out there, she knew, were the homes of the same men who had just fed them. She tried to imagine their lives. Families gathering around tables, saying prayers, laughing. She could almost hear her mother's voice through time. "Remember, Ilse, food tastes better when shared." She hadn't thought of that voice in years. Then she heard it again. The laughter. Soft, unbelieving, nervous. The women around her were laughing in low whispers, remembering moments from the feast. Lotta, who had once served in the Reich labor service, was mimicking the way the Americans said, "Pass the gravy." Hilda was talking about the butter, real butter, spread thick on cornbread. Someone else admitted she'd taken an extra biscuit and hidden it in her pocket, just in case. And when they laughed, something inside the barracks shifted too. It was as if the air itself had thawed. For months, they had lived under the shadow of fear. Fear of what would happen to them. Fear of what they might become if they stayed too long among the enemy. Yet after one shared meal, that fear began to lose its teeth. The next morning, as the bugle called the routine wake-up, the guards noticed something different. The German women moved faster. They sang while sweeping floors. They joked softly in their own language. A few even nodded at the guards instead of averting their eyes. Doyle, the Texan farmer who had sat beside Ilsa, watched from outside the hall. He told another guard, "You see that? They're smiling. Ain't seen that since they got here." The other guard shrugged. "Maybe they finally realized we ain't the devils their papers said we were." Doyle spat into the dust, his voice low and serious. "Nah, I think they just realized we're people." That afternoon, the women were led back to their usual work. Tending the camp gardens, repairing uniforms, sorting supplies. But the rhythm had changed. When an American soldier passed by and said, "Mornin'," some of them whispered, "Guten Morgen." A few smiled back. It was small, but it was real. At sunset, the sky turned the color of brass. Ilsa lingered by the fence, her fingers grazing the rough wood. She could smell faint traces of smoke and roasted corn drifting from the American side. Someone was burning leftover scraps from the feast. Her eyes followed the smoke up into the golden air until it vanished. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that word of the Thanksgiving event had already reached the nearby ranches. A few of the local families had objected. "Why waste food on the enemy?" they said. "Our boys are dying overseas, and you're feeding Nazis pie." But others, mostly the farmers who worked with POW labor, had defended it. "They work hard," one rancher said. "And maybe if we show a little decency, some boy over there gets the same." That quiet defense carried weight. It spread through the camp like warmth through wood. Days later, when the chaplain came to hold Sunday service, he found more volunteers than ever before. Germans and Americans alike, standing under the open sky, hands clasped, eyes closed. They didn't pray to the same flag. But that morning, their voices lifted in one place, carried by the same wind. "Forgive us our trespasses," the chaplain read, "as we forgive those who trespass against us." The German women whispered the words in their own language. "Vergib uns unsere Schuld." Ilsa said them twice. That night, as the women prepared for bed, Marta pulled the little card with her name, handwritten in careful English script, from her pocket. The ink had smudged a bit where her fingers had held it. She flattened it carefully and looked at it as if it were a photograph. She whispered, "They wrote my name, not a number." The others heard her. No one spoke, because they all understood what that meant. In a world that had turned people into ranks, into masses, into statistics, someone had written their names. Each one, letter by letter. And maybe that was the heaviest part of all, the weight of warmth. It settled over Camp Swift like a second sky. Not heavier, not oppressive, just present. Like a thick blanket laid across a soul too long shivering. And yet, beyond the gates, the war continued. Ardennes, Peleliu, Warsaw in ashes, Japan unbending, Germany still bombing London by night and starving by winter. No one in Camp Swift spoke of it, but they all felt it, in the silence that lingered when the radio clicked off, in the eyes of the guards who stared too long at telegrams, in the roll calls that grew quieter as names from the front stopped being repeated. The women weren't naive. They knew the Reich was failing. But what frightened them more than defeat was this strange new ache that had begun to form in their chests. An ache with no orders, no uniform, no enemy. It came when kindness touched them, and they didn't know how to wear it. One morning, Loda found a biscuit wrapped in paper inside her work crate. Nothing else. No note. Just a biscuit, still warm. She turned it over in her hand for a full minute, unsure if it was a mistake or a message. That evening, she sat on her cot and split it in two, sharing it with Marta without a word. The next morning, another biscuit appeared. This time, with a square of butter tucked inside a wax paper scrap. Ilsa began to suspect one of the guards. But when she asked, Doyle only raised an eyebrow and said, "Guess that's just Thanksgiving spirit hanging around." It wasn't the food that moved them. It was the idea that someone, behind a uniform and a different flag, thought they still mattered enough to be fed quietly. Without fanfare, without gain. That small act made the barbed wire seem thinner somehow. But not everyone welcomed the change. One evening, a new arrival, Clara, captured from an auxiliary staff near Metz, was assigned to Barracks 14. She was older, hard-faced, and sharp-tongued. She scoffed when she heard about the Thanksgiving feast. "You fools," she said coldly. "You think these Americans are your friends? You think biscuits mean mercy? Don't you see what's happening? They are softening you, weakening your German blood." Her voice cracked through the barracks like a whip. Even the younger ones turned away. But Ilsa stood up, slowly, carefully. Not with anger, but something firmer. "We were softened," she said. "Not by weakness, by remembering who we were before the war." Clara spat near the stove. "You've betrayed your homeland." "No," Ilsa replied. "I've remembered my humanity." It wasn't a speech, it was a reckoning. That night, Clara ate alone. The others sat near the windows, heads bent together, passing a book of Goethe's poems between them. They didn't talk about politics. They talked about the time they saw snow in Bavaria, about the way their mothers used to braid their hair, about the music that played in Berlin cafes before uniforms drowned it out. The biscuits kept coming. One guard, a short boy from El Paso with a scar on his cheek, slipped Marta a folded square of paper. It was a drawing, charcoal and smudged. A chicken coop. A small girl in overalls holding a pail. A dog with one ear bent. On the back, it said in broken German, "My sister, Sarah. This was our farm." Marta stared at it for a long time. Then she carefully folded it back and placed it under her pillow. That was the week the snow fell. A rare cold front swept across Texas, and for 2 days the camp was blanketed in white. The air bit at their lungs. The soil froze, and yet no one complained, because the guards passed out extra blankets, because the kitchen made hot broth and brought it out in ladles, because someone, no one ever confessed who, placed pine boughs along the fence posts as if decorating for Christmas. It was still a prison. The barbed wire didn't vanish. The rations didn't change. But something inside the wire had cracked open, and the warmth poured in like broth into chipped mugs, slow, real, and undeniable. Then one afternoon, a jeep arrived from the state capitol. 2 men in stiff suits came to the gate. They spoke with the camp commander, took notes, walked the perimeter, interviewed a few prisoners, formally with translators and clipboards. When they left, the whispers began. "They're evaluating transfer lists," Lotta said. "To where? Maybe Louisiana or California or back to Germany." No one wanted to say it aloud, that they didn't want to go. Not yet, not after this. The ones who had dreamed of escape now found themselves clinging to routine. The woman who once cursed every American now wept at the thought of losing her bunkmates. And Ilsa, who once wrote death reports for the Wehrmacht, now traced the silhouette of Texas on a scrap of cloth as if it were home. Marta asked Ilsa that night, in a whisper too soft for anyone but the walls to hear, "What if we belong nowhere anymore?" Ilsa didn't answer. She simply handed her the biscuit from that morning, still warm, still wrapped, and said, "Then let's start with kindness. It has no country." The words lingered in the stale barracks air, trembling like candlelight in a draught. Marta held the biscuit close to her chest, not because she was hungry, but because it still radiated warmth. It was proof that something in this place defied everything she'd been told. About enemies, about war, about worth. And that night, the letters began. No order was given. No meeting was held. But something in the women had shifted. Deep, silent, unspoken, and it demanded to find its way to paper. Lotta was the first. She retrieved her Red Cross stationery and wrote in stiff, careful script. Liebe Mama. I don't know how to explain this, but the Americans here gave us a feast. Turkey, sweet bread, and even pie. It was not propaganda. It was not a trick. I think they meant it. She paused, stared at the ink, then crossed out the last line. Too sentimental. Too dangerous. She rewrote it. They served us kindly. I was not prepared for kindness. Ilse watched the others begin to write too. One by one, they sat at the edge of their bunks, using crates for desks, elbows bent in concentration, frowns of disbelief on their faces. The paper was thin, the pencils short. The truths they carried, even thinner. For some, it was the first time they had written honestly in years. Clara, the stern one, refused at first. But late that night, when the others were asleep, she lit a stub of candle and scribbled her name at the top of a page. To my brother, it began, then stopped. She stared at it. The pencil trembled in her grip. When the candle finally burned down, the paper remained blank, except for those 3 words, to my brother. But that was more than she'd ever dared. In the days that followed, the guards noticed the shift. The women were quieter, but not in fear. They walked straighter, as if a burden had lifted. They asked to help with chores outside their assigned duties. When the laundry line fell in the wind, they picked it up without being told. When an American dropped his glove, a German woman returned it with a nod and a look. Not of servitude, but of recognition. Recognition that they were all walking wounded. Recognition that even on opposite sides of a war, suffering could echo in familiar tones. Then came the day when Doyle, the cowboy, brought a battered accordion to the edge of the fence. He didn't say anything, just sat down on an overturned crate and began to play. Soft at first. An old tune. Maybe Home on the Range, or maybe something older. Something passed from grandfather to grandson under the porch light. The notes drifted across the yard, carried on the dry Texas air like cotton seeds. The women froze, stood up, turned toward the sound. One of them, Frida, took a single step forward. She had played accordion as a girl, back in Dusseldorf. She raised her hand like she might conduct the wind, then lowered it, embarrassed. Doyle saw. He tipped his hat, and without speaking, shifted the tune. Slower now, minor key, a German lullaby. Several women gasped. One clutched her chest, another wept without hiding her face. Because somehow, without a single word, he had said, I see you. I know you miss home. So do I. After that, everything began to change faster. The chaplain delivered more German Bibles. A few guards brought wildflowers to the kitchen and left them on the windowsills. A lieutenant, whose name no one remembered, arranged for a small set of oil paints and brushes to be given to the barracks. For morale, Marta painted a tree. Not a flag, not a tank, just a tree. One long trunk with branches reaching upward, and birds she imagined, perched between thorns. One afternoon, Red Cross staff arrived with a box of returned mail from Europe. Some letters nearly a year old, battered, water-stained, but real. Lotta received a letter from her uncle. Your mother is alive, it read. She lost the house, but stays with neighbors in Tübingen. We pray for your return. Do not forget who you are. But she wasn't sure anymore who she was. Not after what she had seen. Not after the feast. Not after the soldier who gave her a pie had smiled like he meant it. She folded the letter slowly and placed it beside the Thanksgiving napkin she'd kept beneath her mattress. Then she added one of the wildflowers, now dried and pale yellow. That night, Ilse wrote a different kind of letter. Not to Germany, not to family, but to herself. You are still Ilse. You are not the uniform. You are not the silence. You are not what they told you to be. You are who you choose to be after the next sunrise. She signed it and tucked it into the seam of her pillow. The next morning, she stood at roll call taller than she had in months. She didn't know the war's end. She didn't know her future. But for the first time, she felt something older than politics rising in her blood. Not shame, not fear, but grace. And it began, she knew, with something as small as a biscuit. And it began, she knew, with something as small as a biscuit. The December wind had changed. Cold now, sharp as glass. But it wasn't the weather that made that next morning feel different. It was the sound, or lack of it. No boots slamming on concrete. No barked names at roll call, just birds, just breath. Ilse stepped outside the barracks and stared at the sky, low and gray, heavy with the weight of unshed rain. The ground crunched softly underfoot. Early frost, but it was what wasn't there that stopped her. The guards were gone from the towers. The spotlight lamps were dark, and the gate was open, not fully, just unlatched. A symbolic gesture, perhaps. Or maybe a mistake. A dozen women gathered near the fence line. Some froze in place, unsure. Others inched forward, their shoes leaving shallow tracks in the dirt. Marta whispered, "Is this it? Are they letting us go?" But no siren rang. No truck rumbled. No officer appeared with orders or threats. Just a single piece of paper tacked to the inside of the wooden gate. One line, handwritten. You may walk to the chapel and back today. Stay within sight. Merry Christmas. It was December 23rd. The women looked at each other as if someone had just spoken a language older than words. And then, hesitantly, they stepped forward, through the open gate, beyond the fence. No alarms, no chase, just wind, and the crunch of frost and freedom measured in footsteps. Ilse bent down and touched the grass, half dead but still rooted. She felt tears form, unexpected, stinging, stupid tears, not because she was free, but because someone had trusted her. Trust. The one currency war always destroys first. By the time they reached the small wooden chapel, paint peeling, cross slightly askew, they were breathing like pilgrims. Inside, it was quiet. A single oil lantern burned on the table. No pews, just benches. And beside the lantern, a worn Bible in German. Some sat, some stood. No one prayed aloud, but something was spoken anyway, in silence, in breath, in presence. Outside, they found a pine tree. Not tall, not majestic, just an old thing clinging to life on dry Texas soil. Someone, probably one of the chaplain's aides, had tied small strips of cloth to the branches, red and white and blue. An American flag, gently unraveled into ribbons. Marta stepped forward, reached into her coat, and pulled out a napkin from the Thanksgiving meal. It was still folded in a triangle, faintly stained with cranberry sauce. She tied it to a branch. It fluttered there, awkward, wind-tossed, but hers. That afternoon, when they returned to the camp, the guards were waiting, not with guns, but with trays. Hot cider, molasses cookies, and a single record playing from a phonograph. Silent Night, sung in English, one of the guards said gently. "We heard y'all singing last week. Thought you might want the music too." Ilse took a cup of cider and held it between her palms. The heat sank deep into her bones, more soothing than any medicine. She looked at the young soldier who had handed it to her. Barely 20, freckles on his nose, wedding ring too large for his hand. "What's your name?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then said, Joseph. She nodded. Thank you, Joseph. He looked down. My mother's name was Ilsa. That night, the women asked if they could decorate the barracks. No one said no. So they did. Pine boughs from the fence line, twine woven into stars, bits of cloth dyed with coffee to make ornaments. A single white bed sheet cut into the shape of an angel and pinned to the wall above the stove. Clara, the last to soften, stitched together small pouches filled with lavender, folded from old uniform scraps. She handed them out in silence. Lotta wrote a song and taught it to Marta, who had a voice like breath on glass. They sang it in German first, then tried to hum it in English. It was awkward, beautiful, real. They didn't talk about Hitler. They didn't talk about surrender. They didn't talk about home. They talked about snow and pears and which American candy was best. Butterscotch won. Then on Christmas Eve, something impossible happened. The guards entered the barracks, carrying instruments, a violin, a banjo, a harmonica. They asked gently, "Would you join us for carols?" No one moved at first. Then Marta stepped forward, then Lotta, then Ilsa. One by one, the women joined the guards in the cold mess hall. Benches were dragged close. Blankets were shared. Boots clomped against the floor in time with rhythm. They sang Stille Nacht in German, then O Little Town of Bethlehem in English. And when someone asked what they should sing next, Marta said quietly, "Anything that doesn't feel like war." So they sang a lullaby. One Ilsa remembered from her grandmother's house. One of the Americans had heard once but couldn't name. And it echoed into that cold Texas night, carried out beyond the camp, across the still fields where no sides remained. That night, the fence disappeared, not in wood or wire, but in the hearts of those who had built it. It would take weeks for the world beyond Camp Swift to catch up with what had already begun inside. War still screamed across Europe and the Pacific. In Bastogne, American soldiers were freezing in foxholes. In Manila, civilians were starving. And yet, in this quiet pocket of Texas, on the edge of a country still burying its dead, something else was unfolding, a quiet rebellion of the soul. It wasn't treason. It wasn't surrender. It was something older than ideology. It was mercy, and mercy, once seen, could not be unseen. On December 26th, the camp radio broke that spell, but not in the way anyone expected. The morning had started like any other, cold, calm. The women had risen early, shaken the frost from their blankets, and lined up for rations. There was laughter now, easy and unguarded, drifting from bunk to bunk. Then came the crackle. It started with static, then a burst of music, then the clipped, urgent voice of a radio announcer. We interrupt this broadcast for an update from the front. American forces have pushed back the German offensive in Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge is turning. Enemy casualties reported to be in the tens of thousands. The mess hall fell silent. Hands froze midair. A spoon clattered to the floor. No one spoke. But their eyes found each other across the tables, across the invisible line between prisoner and guard. They all understood what this meant. The Reich was breaking. Even the most loyal among them could no longer pretend. Germany had no more fuel, no more reserves, no more hope. Cities were firebombed ruins, families scattered, their leaders silent or lying. Ilsa closed her eyes. She had read casualty lists before, typed them, filed them. Now she imagined her brother's name among the dead. Not even for the first time, but for the first time without armor. Marta pressed her napkin to her lips, not to cry, but to breathe. Lotta whispered, "My uncle is in the Ardennes." No one answered, because what could be said? But it wasn't just grief that filled the room. It was guilt, not for losing the war, but for surviving it, and doing so in a place where their enemies had given them blankets, soap, pie, and names. They felt the burden of it all. Each kindness now weighed like a stone on their backs. And then the guards did something that would haunt the women for years to come. They lowered the volume, but left the radio on. not to taunt, but to include, as if saying, "We're not hiding this from you. This pain belongs to all of us now." Later that day, the chaplain called an open hour in the chapel. Not a sermon, not a mass, just silence. Ilsa went. So did Marta. So did 32 others. They didn't kneel. They didn't pray aloud. They just sat. Then someone began to sing, not loudly, but clearly. Not a hymn, not a national song, just a lullaby, a mother's song. And for the first time, Ilsa imagined something she'd never allowed herself to before. What if kindness wasn't the enemy of loyalty? What if it was its only proof? Because if their homeland, whatever was left of it, was worth loving, then surely it must be made from something better than rage. That night in the barracks, Marta did not sleep. Instead, she wrote, not to her family, not to the Red Cross, but to the American soldier with freckles on his nose. She didn't know his name, just that his boots were always polished, and that he once gave her a handkerchief when she coughed during assembly. Dear soldier, you don't know me, but I know your kindness. I know how you look away when we cry. I know how you tip your helmet when you serve food. I know you gave me your apple last week, though I pretended not to notice. I was told you were my enemy. But you made me remember I am still a girl, still alive, still capable of being grateful. If you never see this, I want the world to know I tried to say thank you. The girl with the red scarf. She folded it and hid it inside the small pocket sewn behind her bunk's wooden frame. It stayed there long after the war, because she wasn't ready yet to hand it over. She wasn't ready yet to admit that the fence in her mind had fallen too. Meanwhile, Ilsa took her pillow apart. Inside, where she'd once hidden the letter to herself, she now placed something else. A drawing Marta had made. It was simple. A tree with two trunks growing from opposite roots, leaning toward one another, their branches tangled above. Beneath it, Marta had written one word in both languages. Zuhause, home. And for the first time, Ilsa let herself believe that word might not belong to a country anymore. That it could belong to a choice, to how we treat those we're told to hate, to how we carry the memory of mercy, even when the world tells us to forget. But some memories grow stubborn in silence. And that winter, what no one dared speak aloud now beat in every woman's chest. They didn't want to leave. Not yet, not like this. Not when the war was ending and the world they had come from no longer existed. Not in the way they remembered. Not in the way they once defended. Germany, once shouted like a prayer in steel and anthem, had become a shadow. A place of ruins. And for some, even a place of shame. But here, inside the wire, something had survived. Dignity, routine, names, kindness. And they weren't ready to give it up. The first notice came in early January, delivered by an American lieutenant with a clipboard and careful eyes. Transfer orders, a rotation, 10 names called to prepare for transport to a different camp. Louisiana, they thought, or maybe California. Rumors changed daily. No reason was given. Just a date, January 9th. And 10 names. Marta's was among them. She stood motionless as the others gathered around her, offering what comfort they could. Ilsa placed a folded handkerchief in her palm. "It still smells like cinnamon," she said softly. "From Christmas. Keep it." Marta nodded, eyes hollow. "It's just another camp," someone whispered. "Same fences, same food." But that was the lie they told to protect themselves. Because Camp Swift wasn't just another camp anymore. It had become something no one expected, a memory they hadn't even finished making. That night, Marta sat on her bunk and stared at the unfinished letter to the soldier with freckles. The one she'd written, but never sent. She reread the last line. "If you never see this, I want the world to know I tried to say thank you." She folded it tighter, then changed her mind. She stood, walked quietly to the barracks door, and slipped the letter into the wooden slats where the guards passed their paperwork. She didn't sign it. She didn't even hope it would reach him. She just needed it to exist. 2 days later, the transport truck arrived. Gray, loud. Its tires chewed at the soft earth like it didn't care who it carried. The women stood near the gate, watching, waiting, saying nothing. A corporal called the names again. Marta stepped forward. Lotta wrapped her arms around her. Sing when you miss us. Ilsa kissed her cheek. Keep drawing trees. Then something happened no one expected. As Marta climbed into the back of the truck, an American soldier, a different one, older, with weathered eyes and a quiet way about him, walked forward and handed her a folded piece of paper. She opened it. It was her letter. But beneath it, scribbled in shaky, unsure handwriting, was a reply. Dear girl with the red scarf, you reminded me I wasn't just a guard. Thank you for your eyes, for noticing my apple, for being brave enough to feel. The boy with the polished boots, Marta didn't cry. She smiled. And that, more than tears, left the rest of them standing in stunned silence. The truck rumbled away, and the camp felt smaller. That night, the remaining women couldn't sleep. The bunks felt colder, the air too still. Marta's laughter, the high, clear note that once bounced from barracks to barracks, was gone. Lotta whispered in the dark. I miss her already. Ilsa didn't answer. She was staring at the ceiling, tracing the pattern of knots in the wood, thinking, wondering what would happen when it was her name called next. Would she be sent to another camp? Or, worse, would she be sent home? Because home no longer had shape. What if it wasn't a city? What if it wasn't even a country? What if home was the place where someone wrote your name on a napkin and served you pie? Where someone lowered their weapon first? Where someone said, you've earned it, not because you fought, but because you tried to live decently after the fighting was done. Outside, coyotes howled in the dark hills beyond the fence. Inside, the women pulled their blankets tighter and lay in silence, counting not the days until freedom, but the days until departure, because now that was the greater fear, not prison, but parting. The next morning, Clara, once the hardest, coldest of them all, stood in the mess hall and asked if she could lead Grace before breakfast. Everyone turned to look, even the guards. She cleared her throat. Her voice cracked, but only once. Für das Brot und die Menschen, die es mit offenen Händen teilen, danken wir. For the bread, and for the people who share it with open hands, we give thanks. No one clapped. No one needed to. Because everyone, German and American, understood this was no longer just survival. This was communion. And communion, once broken, is never forgotten. It lingers in the mouth like warm bread, in the heart like a fire that doesn't go out even when the lights do. In the weeks that followed Marta's departure, Camp Swift changed again. Quieter, slower, softer, but not in sorrow. In reverence. The women cleaned the barracks without being asked. They embroidered small stitches along the edges of their sheets. They painted birds on scrap wood. And they began to pass down stories. Not orders, not warnings, not propaganda, but stories. Stories of the feast, of the biscuits, of the moment the guard offered a second helping without blinking, of the small miracles that seemed to appear between fence posts and folded napkins. But more than stories, they passed down symbols, and none was more sacred than the blanket. It had been given months before, to one of the older women who'd arrived ill from a processing center. Army-issue wool, rough and olive green. But what made it different was what came after. Stitched along the bottom hem, thread pulled from old uniforms, was a single line of German script. Wir sind mehr als das, was man uns nennt. We are more than what they call us. No one admitted who had written it, but it passed from woman to woman in the weeks that followed. Never owned, only held. Each recipient chosen not for rank or age, but for need. Lotta held it when she got word her sister's city had been bombed. Clara wrapped herself in it when she first confessed that her brother had been SS, and that she no longer knew what to believe about anything anymore. Ilsa slept under it the night she had the dream of the Thanksgiving table again. But this time, the Americans were not serving the food. They were sitting with the German women, and no one could remember who had been prisoner and who had been guard. She woke with tears in her ears. She didn't tell anyone. But the next morning, she passed the blanket to the youngest girl in the camp. Her name was Anna. She had arrived late. Her eyes were sunken, and she rarely spoke. But when Ilsa gave her the blanket, Anna held it to her cheek and whispered, "Does this mean I belong?" Ilsa nodded. "Yes, as long as you remember why." That week, a new group of German prisoners arrived, Navy auxiliaries and 2 nurses from North Africa. Thin, exhausted, still sharp with suspicion, still clinging to the old words, enemy, duty, fatherland. The older women didn't argue. They didn't try to convince them. They just made space, offered hot water, split rations. And one night, after the frost came in hard and thick, they passed the blanket to the youngest of the new arrivals. No explanation, just kindness. That's how the blanket became more than fabric. It became a vow that this camp, behind this wire, under this Texas sky, would be the place where the war ended, not in treaties, but in hearts. And though few would speak it aloud, a question had begun to take root among them all. What if this was the real war? Not the one with bombs and flags, but the one inside. The one where you choose what to carry when everything else has been taken from you. The Americans noticed the change too. Fewer arguments, fewer sick call requests, fewer incidents. One guard wrote in his logbook, "They sweep the yard before I ask." I caught one saluting our flag this morning, not mockingly, but like she meant it. I don't know what to do with that. Another officer, in a letter home, wrote, "It's strange. I came here to watch prisoners. Now I think I'm watching a kind of healing, one I don't fully understand." In February, word reached the camp that Allied troops had crossed the Rhine. Germany was crumbling by the hour. Some women wept. Others simply stood still for a long, long time. Ilsa walked to the chapel again. No sermon waited, no music. Just light from the high window, catching dust in its beams like snowfall that had forgotten how to land. She sat on the same bench where Marta once hummed, and for the first time she prayed. Not for victory, not for survival, but for truth, that someday, when she told this story, she would find the words to make people understand, and that a feast, a blanket, a name spoken kindly, could undo the teachings of empire more effectively than war ever could. She pressed her hand flat against the wood. The warmth of sun still lived there, and she whispered, "Let me remember this the right way, the way Marta would have, the way they all would have, if given the chance." Later that night, Clara approached Ilsa near the barrack stove. She held out the blanket. Ilsa shook her head. "It's not my turn." Clara's voice was different now, quieter, unguarded. "It's not about turns anymore. It's yours now." Ilsa hesitated, then took it, and for the first time, she let herself feel what it meant to be chosen. Not for rank or fear or usefulness, but for trust. She didn't cry. She just held the wool close, sat on her bunk, and watched the wind through the barrack slats like it might carry some part of her toward something unnamed and sacred, like home, but not the one they came from. That home, brick, bombed, and distant, was already turning into a place of shadows and questions. The cities had changed. The flags were falling. The voices on the radio had grown brittle and strange. Mothers wrote letters now without the old pride. Some didn't write at all. But here, in the strange stillness of Camp Swift, the women found a different kind of soil. They planted nothing, but something had grown, and by the first warmth of March, it was time to leave. The orders came quietly, without drama. Typed, folded, read aloud at morning muster. The war in Europe was drawing to its final breath. Transfers were accelerating. Camps were being emptied, processed. The great machine of repatriation, had begun. Ilsa's name was on the list. So was Lotta's, and Clara's, and Anna's. This time no one gasped. No one wept aloud. They simply stood in the Texas sun, looking at the words on the clipboard, and let the silence speak for them. The guards were solemn. One of them, the freckled soldier Marta had once written about, tipped his helmet in Ilsa's direction. She nodded back. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. That evening, the women packed what little they were allowed. One blanket, one change of clothes, one parcel of letters, nothing more. And yet, their greatest burden was invisible. It was the weight of memory. Lotta tried to memorize the sound of the chapel doors creak. Clara ran her fingers one last time along the edge of the mess hall table where they had eaten turkey. Ilsa knelt in the dirt outside the barracks and buried a single strip of paper. The original name card from Thanksgiving. The one with her name, carefully written in American cursive. She didn't want to carry it. She wanted it to stay. Let the land keep it. Let it root. Let someone find it years from now and wonder who she was and why someone had once called her by name instead of number. At dawn, the truck arrived. It was the same model as Marta's, but cleaner now. Painted. Repaired. The women climbed aboard in silence, not with fear, but with reverence. They wore no insignias, no flags, just plain clothes, clean hands, and eyes that had once stared at the enemy and now saw only people. Before the engine started, one of the guards climbed into the back. He held a brown paper parcel. Inside it was the blanket. Folded, pressed. He held it out to Ilsa, then hesitated. This belonged here, he said softly. But maybe it belongs to you now. Ilsa didn't answer right away. Then she reached out, took the blanket, and placed it on her lap. We'll carry it, she said, so we remember how not to become what we once were. The engine turned over, the tires rolled, and Camp Swift, with its wire fences and red clay paths and rows of simple barracks, grew smaller behind them, but not gone, never gone, because some places carve themselves into your ribs. Not for what they take, but for what they return. And when they crossed the camp gate for the last time, the women did not cheer. They did not wave. They simply looked back and held still, as if committing it to memory. The wind rose. The trees whispered. And somewhere inside the chapel, though no one stood there anymore, the dust still danced in the morning light. Years later, after the war, long after Germany had split and healed and split again, Ilsa would sit with her granddaughter on a park bench in Freiburg. The girl would ask, "Did they hurt you?" Ilsa would shake her head. "No," she'd say. "But they were your enemies," the child would insist. And Ilsa would smile, slow and soft, like someone remembering the smell of pumpkin pie in a warm wooden room. "They fed us," she would reply. "That's all you need to know." But why? Ilsa would pause then and touch the frayed edge of the old olive-green blanket folded in her lap and say, "Because someone has to go first. Someone has to choose kindness before the war ends." Then she would lift her eyes to the trees, and somewhere, far off, beyond memory, beyond names, the sound of footsteps would echo down a dirt road where enemies once walked side by side and left no hatred behind, only the memory of warmth, only the sound of a name spoken with care, only the silence of being seen. This story is not about victors or prisoners. It is not about battles won or empires lost. It is about a wooden table, a loaf of bread, a stitched blanket passed from hand to hand. It is about the moment when a stranger becomes a guest. It is about the choice to feed instead of fear. The wind remembers. The earth remembers. Let us remember too.